Hi, my name is Chris Goldthorpe. I run chrischess.com, and this is a video on the Ruy Lopez for black. Obviously, it's not going to be exhaustive, and it's going to focus primarily on one variation, which I would recommend to you for its safety. The people watching this channel are typically under 1600, and the Ruy Lopez just isn't played that often in those rating levels. For that matter, spending your time on opening preparation is usually suboptimal. The time you spend would probably be better spent on tactic study and going over games. Learning end games will have a lot more effect on your actual results. There's way too many games where somebody's got a very good position at move 20 only to make several blunders on both sides before move 30. So that will have much more of an effect on who wins the game than knowing opening theory 20 moves deep. So why should you study the Ruy Lopez for black at all? Well, just to have some confidence in which lines you've chosen to play and to know some of the terminology so that later on, when it makes sense for you to go into it further, you'll know which lines are called what and how to find them. By the way, chessgames.com can help you to find complete games, which is a good thing to do with the Ruy Lopez in particular. A lot of these theoretical lines go way past move 20, and it's almost a total waste of time to memorize anything beyond about the 14th move. Usually the game's going to go another way, and even if it doesn't, there'll be big blunders after that on both sides that will determine who actually wins. So, having said that, let's take a little brief overview of the Ruy Lopez. As you can see, among very strong players, c5 is about twice as common as e5, but e5 is a good move. And knight f3 is, of course, almost all the games here. Almost any time you watch school chess events among kids, almost at least 80% of the games get to this position, and then they usually play the Italian or the Scotch or the four knights. If you're studying this for black, you probably need to spend more time on the Italian and even the four knights and the Scotch than the Ruy Lopez, which you probably don't see so often. Maybe you're studying this video because some friend of yours plays it often, or you're in a tournament and your next opponent plays it often, so you're in the right place. Let's turn the board around so we can see it from black's point of view. And you may know that the Ruy Lopez starts with this move. Attacking the knight that defends the pawn that the knight attacks. So the idea eventually, though it's not a threat right now, is to destroy the defender with a little bit of pawn structure damage at the cost of giving up the bishop pair to put more pressure on this pawn. So black's got a lot of ways that they can react to this, not that many of them are good. There's the Casio, moving this knight to here. Of course, the idea there is that if he takes the knight, it's replaced by another knight and the pawn is still guarded. There's the classical, or the Cordell's, the Casio, Cordell's defense, or classical, where the bishop goes to c5. And yes, white can do the fork trick, or he can castle, or he can play c3. c3 is recommended. And the reason I'm not showing you these on the board very much is because I'm not going to end up recommending them anyway. This move is called bird's defense, moving a piece for the second time. Not really recommended. There's this move, the Schliemann counterattack, which I rarely recommend any unusual move that moves the F pawn in the opening. There's the immediate development of the knight, the so-called Berlin defense, which is what I'm going to recommend for you. And then the A6 is the next best recommendation, this move. A6 and knight F6 are pretty much the most important two responses to be familiar with until you've decided which one of them you're going to stick with. Now the Steinitz defense, D6, is perfectly playable, or in the form of the Steinitz deferred, where you go A6, bishop goes back, and then you play D6. There's also a Schliemann deferred where you do that and go here. But between the Steinitz, A6, and knight F6, those are the important ones, and by far the most important are knight F6 and A6, which comprise, between the two of them, just about 90% of all the responses between strong players. And the Steinitz is probably a little better than its reputation, but at lower levels it does just fine. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at briefly the Steinitz, and then A6 and its offshoots, and knight F6, the Berlin. So we'll save the best for last, and we'll go with the Steinitz variation. Wilhelm Steinitz was the first official world champion. So that's a rather intuitive variation, because with the Steinitz, black defends his e-pawn before he really needs to. And so that's why some lower ranked players play it without really realizing that they don't have to guard the pawn that early, but it's still a decent move for black. So starting from the beginning, we E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop to B5, Ruy Lopez, and then black plays D6, giving pawn protection to this pawn. Now the knight is pinned, and so no longer actually guards the pawn, but that can be remedied with a developing move, and it almost always is. So there's really just two main lines here, and they're pretty much the only ones you're going to see. At lower levels, sometimes you'll see knight C3. So a quick look at that. Knight C3. We'll go from here. Knight C3 immediately. And unpins the knight. Castles is the main line here. And then you get the other bishop out. And then he'll sometimes trade here just to be able to make this move. This knight can come out. And he cannot really win a pawn at E5. But if he guards the E4 pawn, he's prepared to. After this trade, black will just go ahead and castle. He's not really concerned with knight takes at C6. It's a good way to get another piece out. And you may wonder, well, what is that move about? Well, if this knight doesn't trade for the bishop and ends up coming back here, you can push some more and make it go back again. Attacking the queen, gets a pawn back, and then he causes a pawn's worth of damage. Note that the white queen is attacked, but the black queen here is also. And that's about as far as you can expect yourself to remember, because by the time that actually comes up in a game, are you going to really remember all those moves? It's mostly valuable to see which squares the pieces end up on and sort of take a mental picture of this, and then having been acquainted with that move. Now, I said knight c3 is sort of a minor variation for white, so we're going to go back to before he does that and look at the other main line for white here, which is castles. And then you go ahead and attack his e-pawn. He can do this. Again, there's some other moves there that are hardly worth even, you know, going into, except for knight c3 seems to kind of transpose to the other line. Since this is a video, you can always stop it, pause it, write stuff down, and ignore it if it's not important to you. Okay, so d4 is a more common way for it to go there. But this whole thing is based on Black's very general idea that he wants to just be able to castle without contesting White's space very much at first. Use e5 as a strong point defense, and to just get his queen and rooks out. And it kind of sidesteps most of the really mainline theory, which shouldn't actually be all that important, but you know, people have their ego. They want to feel like they're making the very best move. Making the very best move at move 13 has very little to do with who ends up winning the game. So it's more important to understand the general ideas. Now, d4 is the main line, what you're going to get when you play the Steinitz. People play this move. So you unpin your knight. Now, they can just push the pawn forward on your knight, but it's not a particularly good move and leaves White's center pawns frozen. And then we get a closed center, which French defense players like, even though this is the other color. See that now, this is not a terrible move, this knight f6 here, but it's not the move I would really recommend. But this could lead to a trap. These are the main lines. Now, if on the 7th move, if he castles here right away, which might look okay, it falls into what's called the Dresden trap. And he's won a clean pawn. So if you play the Steinitz, you're going to play d6, unpin your knight, and be aware of this trap and don't let that happen. And that's about as much as you can really expect yourself to remember until you see several real full-length games. And Black just seeks simple development. You know, as Black, getting a draw is good. As White, you have to win. And that's for masters. Okay, so next going down the list are the variations that start with a6, because I'm going to show you the Berlin defense last, which doesn't use a6. And the basic difference is that with a6, White prepares to prevent the bishop from having the option of capturing the knight. But it comes at a cost. He spends an extra move, but that's not to be counted because black forces white to move his bishop a couple of extra times. And in those lines, the black knight all of the time ends up making several moves to compensate. But a downside for black is that his pawn here at b5 becomes a target. White will play a4, moves like queen e2 at some point, and force black to spend thinking time and resources to defend this. So the most direct offshoot is the exchange variation. So let's see, that would be here. And after the moves, after this a6 move, some unsophisticated beginners think that they can win a pawn here for white, which is not to be tried. But the exchange variation in and of itself is not totally mistaken. In fact, Bobby Fischer used to play it. That's why I have his picture here besides this. After the capture, naturally, you should capture with your d-pawn, releasing the queen and the bishop. And now there's basically three book lines. Knight c3, d4, or as Fischer used to play, castles. So you may wonder, well, why don't I take this pawn? And the answer is here, which is better than queen here. You just go here. And then if he backs up, then you take this pawn and put him in check. So, and black has the bishop pair to compensate for his pawns. So knight takes e5 here is no good. Knight c3 is playable. d4 is sort of an endgame opening. What I mean by that is I've had students that I had them playing this as white so that they typically get into an endgame right away to this position. And they very reliably get to this position against almost any person who plays knight c6 on the second move. And from there, then their experience may help them where the other person doesn't usually play this as black. There's other moves there that are also pretty playable, like bishop to d6. But black wants to get castled quickly. That move looks odd, I know. But it gets the king out of the way of the rook. Like your 1,600 players are going to play that move. I mean, already here, you know, you're likely to see a lot of other things happen in a real game. But the black king safely gets over to the queen side, and these doubled pawns are not such a problem for black. So as black here, you want to get your knight maybe to c6. The rest of the time it goes to g6, but it wants to guard this e5 square. It's a little bit difficult to get this bishop out sometimes, but it's rarely worth it to fianchetto it. So that's the d4 line for you as black. Now if he does take with his knight, which I wouldn't recommend for white as you might expect, I would just hit that knight and make it move, and then trade queens here, forcing him to lose castling, or a little bit better for him to undevelop. And this is just fine for black. According to the computer, a little bit better. So this is one to know if you're going to play a6 lines, because it's the first thing you wonder and worry about it, and it's one of white's early offshoots from the other lines. So now there's the Marshall Gambit, and there's the Chigorin and the Breyer system, which can come further down the line. So we're going to look at next the open variation, which sidesteps those. And we'll reach this position in the open. Right after white castles, we'll take this pawn. So after these moves, he attacks the pawn, black defends it, white attacks the defender, he attacks the attacker of the defender, and if white doesn't play the exchange variation now, then this is really the only other move that makes sense. Because although a6 is not in and of itself all that good, it's not a negative. So if white had played the Italian and then gave black the option of making two moves in a row, provided one of them were a6, then black should say, sure, I'll do that. So this keeps the bishop on the same line as the king. As soon as his pawn moves, the knight is pinned. And then this is the staple for black. So this is what you would do as black after a4 when he doesn't do the exchange variation. Now castles, there are some other moves here for white, but besides knight c3 and d3, and d3 is a more serious alternative, as we'll see a little bit later. Castles is what everybody does here. Now, white is actually threatening to win a pawn now, because if it were his move, he could take the knight, you take back, and then he just wins the pawn here, because queen d4 no longer gets the pawn back. The knight would go back here, and see if you see why he should not take the pawn. Because the rook would pin his king. It would pin the queen to the king. So therefore, putting the bishop at e7, as you would do in the closed variation, protects against losing the pawn in that manner. And then that's why he puts the rook there. And so that's why black then prevents the possibility of the knight capture with b5. But in the open variation, black says, okay, I'll just take it now right away. And there's two main approaches here. And as there are when a6, bishop a4 don't happen here, like in the Berlin, as we'll see later. There's going rook e1 immediately, and then there's d4. Because the black king not only hasn't castled, but can't castle on the next move. So when he does this, you should immediately get the bishop away. Then keep that pawn from moving forward. White gets this pawn, but he's just getting his pawn back. But he has now opened this line of the queen to this pawn. So black must guard that d5 pawn like this. And then c3 prevents this knight from coming closer right away and gives the bishop a way to get away from this knight if the knight would go here. He has an extra incentive to go over here too, which is to move this c pawn up. And then he'd get to trade for the bishop, which he doesn't mind doing because the rook is guarded. So with this move, he prepares bishop to c2 and prevents the knight from coming up. And now we have sort of a split. There's bishop to e7 and bishop to c5. And here, I would recommend bishop to c5. However, bishop e7 is not a mistaken move, but it is involved with the so-called Tarrasch trap. So I'll just show that to you. This is the Tarrasch trap of the open variation. And here, knight to b2 is actually a better move for white. Castles. knight d4. You might wonder, why doesn't he take this pawn? Because the knight would not be guarded then, so f3 would win something. So he takes this way. He takes back, and then he attacks over here. But if he doesn't do it that way, there's a mistake to fall into. Because when he goes knight to d4, if you think, well, I'll guard the knight and the bishop both with the queen by moving to here, that falls into the Tarrasch trap, and then white takes here. And notice that no matter how black takes back, this pawn on d5 is pinned, which means rook takes knight is coming next. So white wins a whole piece. So you can see by the evaluation that's pretty bad news for black. Luckily for him, he doesn't have to fall into that even if he plays the bishop e7 line. But going back, I want to show you why I like the bishop c5 line better for black. Because it prepares the possibility of something called the Dilworth attack. Normally, trading a knight and a bishop, especially when they're already developed out here for a rook and a pawn, is a bad idea. I mean, if you use the old-fashioned 1946 piece evaluation, and you say 5 plus 1 equals 3 plus 3, even then you've missed the fact that these pieces are already very much developed and very active, where these aren't. And black spends a total of 3 knight moves and 2 bishop moves to trade for a pawn that never moved and a rook that moved only once. And if he thinks he's getting the king out, there's no attack on the king after that. But more modern analysis of piece imbalances shows that we should really value minor pieces at 3.5. And for that matter, when you have a bishop pair, they're worth an extra half. So if you have 2 bishops worth 7.5 and you give away one so that the remaining one is worth 3.5, that's like you're giving away 4 for the bishop and 3.5 for the knight. It's like you're losing 7.5 for 6.25, because the more modern valuation of a rook is 5.25 instead of just 5. But that having been the case, black has an extra reason to do it, because here he does manage to not only open the F file but line up his queen and the rook against the king. That's why he's motivated to do it. Now when black makes this move, when white makes this bishop c2 move, now white can go for the Dilworth attack. Now that the rook is pinned, he goes here first. White has nothing better than this. Then he goes ahead and does this, and then his queen goes here. And then knight f1 is the normal move for white. Now, I'm not going to tell you that black is winning here, but you can see he's not losing. And we've gotten 15 moves into the game here. And at this point, black is not in the kind of position that's going to make him wonder what he should do. In other words, it's clear this rook is coming over here. He's going to put his bishop here. He might put this knight here, and he's going to attack the king. So his strategy is easy to determine. It might continue like this. Okay, so you hope if you're the black pieces. So this is a little bit about the open variation. Sometimes people wonder in this position, they say, well, why can't he take the pawn? And the answer is, you can. So next I'm going to look at the the martial attack, or sometimes called the martial gambit. Which I thought was in here. Maybe not. Okay. So the martial attack, named after Frank Marshall, starts with moves we've seen before. And we went past the Berlin, now we went past the exchange variation, and now black doesn't play the open variation, he plays the closed. So now he is protected against losing his pawn, because after takes, queen here does work, because when the knight goes here he can still take the pawn, because rook e1 does not pin the queen because the bishop's in the way. Therefore white directly defends the pawn. And now black must follow through with the plan he made with a6, which is to make the bishop unable to capture the c6 knight that defends the e5 pawn. White's next move is obvious. Now he castles. This is there are some anti-martial systems here, because when black doesn't castle, he normally plays d6 first so that the pawn can be guarded, so that he can move the knight here and try to trade it for the bishop. And for that reason, white plays c3, and we're going to see that in the other variations. So with this move, black signals that he may be ready to play the martial gambit. Now, Garry Kasparov is a fan of just playing h3, and then black will, as often as not, just play d6, and then we've transposed right back with c3 into the main line that we're going to see later. So here's a few so-called anti-martial lines. This move comes up because the rook is unguarded, so it creates a threat here. And easy enough for black to do this. And that's about as far as you're going to expect yourself to remember anyway. Both knights and both bishops are placed, and the pawn structure is set up here. Now, going back, there's another, besides a4, another so-called anti-martial system, and that's immediate d4, designed to make this e-pawn mobile. So he can go here to try to guard it, and then he can just make it supported like this. And yes, bishop g4 is also a move there for white. That's why white sometimes plays h3 first here. And then once h3 is played, the bishop usually wants to go over here. So h6 can work out like a waiting move to see if he's going to do that. This rook e8 and bishop to f8, it should be obvious that the knight and the bishop are in on that plan to pressure this pawn. So naturally, you should not be expecting yourself to memorize all of these moves. But if you really want to do that, you can play the video over and over. Okay, so this is what the martial gambit really aims to do is, after castling, is the hope that white will just go ahead and play into the gambit, and then he makes the gambit. Players familiar with this sit there and look at this and go, hey, wait a minute, I can win a pawn. Yes, you can. Takes, takes, takes. And bishop to b7 used to be a move. Queen d6 used to be a move. No, that would lose a piece, wouldn't it? After knight takes and rook takes, you have to guard this knight. This is the way this is played these days. D3 was considered from time to time, but here you're already at the 12th move, so how much of your time are you going to spend preparing for an opening you get in less than 10% of your game? So let's just look at what's most popular here. This move, then he goes back, and now it's obvious that black is attacking white. There's no knight over here, and both of his bishops are aimed over there. So for the low price of one pawn, black has a strong attack. Now the computer tends to like white because computers always like material, and they can analyze it 724,000 positions per second. So he's not too scared of blundering. But if you're a real human being as white, even among grandmasters, black wins these just as well as any other non-gambit position. This is the move white needs to make. Goes here, goes here. The computer usually tells us bishop e6 is actually the best move after you give it time to think. But if you're going to gambit a pawn against a real human, I would recommend this move to prepare to attack as much as you can. Forces this. The queen must be ready to go to f1 in the event of a bishop f3, which no longer makes sense now. And then here, and these are all like computer moves, best moves, so we're not going to see black checkmating white like we might in real games, even between grandmasters. Of course, black doesn't win every time. And this is, advantage to white, like all openings. But in real games, it's very easy for white to go wrong and end up checkmated. This idea of moving the pawn to f5 and f4, supported by other pieces, is also very dangerous against white. So I would recommend, if you're going to play the Marshall Gambit, C88 is the ECO code. Look up some whole games and see short games where black wins. Find some inspiration for it. So now we're going to look at like the Breyer system, named after a man called Gyula Breyer. Oh, okay, we didn't save his picture. In any event, the Breyer is an alternative to some similar moves, as almost all of these Ruy Lopez systems are. So this one starts with a6 and bishop a4 and knight f6, and this is the castles line. Now if white plays d3 early, in particular anytime black plays knight f6 he plays d3, then whether it's the Berlin system or a system with a6 first by black, it prevents the open Ruy Lopez, and it also prevents the Marshall attack, and gives white a little more sway on how things go, but it's also less aggressive. So if you're the black pieces, you don't really need to worry about it. So this is progressing as it was before. And now, if black castles and white plays h3, which I mentioned Garry Kasparov does, then black can just play d6 and we get right back to this line, and it just transposes to this. So with a potentially closed center, that move is worth it In the past, d4 was one of the moves that white would make, but bishop to g4 was pretty strong against it, and more modern games, they don't do that. They have the h3 move that prevents this pin right away. And now there's a few different moves here, and for years and years the most common was this knight a5. Funny looking as it is, the knight does the same thing it does in the brayer, except it's off to the side, but it gets out of the way of this bishop aiming at the pawn from b7, gets out of the way of the rook helping to control the c file, and it gets out of the way of this pawn that wants to come up to c5 to help make a bind on d4. So that was called the Chigorin system. However, in the 1970s, this move became more popular, and it's a really silly looking move. I mean, the first time I ever saw this move, I was going over game number 10 of the Fischer-Spassky match from a pocket paperback made by Reshevsky, published by the New York Times in descriptive notation. It says knight to knight 1. And I thought it was a typographical error. You know, it seems very strange to take this knight and undevelop him and put him back. But the idea is, just like knight a5, to get out of the way of the bishop so the bishop can help aim here. He's going to reposition his knight, put the bishop on b7. Eventually this rook will go here. This pawn will go to c5, and the queen goes to c7 to help guard this pawn, almost like in the Sicilian or the Najdorf or something. So it might seem to require some justification. Well, here it is. Well, in this line where the knight goes here, the knight ends up moving many times, as it does here, and the white bishop also ends up moving several times. He goes to b5, to a4, to b3, and then to c2, all without any files opening. And white also doesn't have these pieces developed. So black has time to do this, and if, as you would guess, the knight's going to reposition itself over here on d7, and this bishop will go here. So a typical way for white to play is to put more pressure here. Then the knight comes over to guard e5. He gets another piece out. He puts more pressure. He defends more. And then he goes here. In the 72 match where Fischer played Spassky in this position, Fischer closed up and blocked the queen side with this move b4 and then a4, a5, where a more modern approach is to attempt to get that knight to f5, which happens really frequently. This is just getting out of the rook sway. The rook wants to aim at e4, and he wants to take here, and then the rook, the knight, and the bishop will all aim at that. And the knight comes up just in time, and then this strange looking move is okay with the bishop back here and stops the knight from coming up. And black may, in time, play f5 and start to play this sort of like a King's Indian attack against white. a4, c5. So when he closes the center, now this light squared bishop has to decide where it wants to go. And then he goes here to make room for the knight. That is not a problem. And then he has to abandon that idea. And the rook on e8 guards this pawn, so we don't have to worry about him giving up his bishop pair. And again, you shouldn't necessarily try to memorize all those moves. Just remember the ideas for black of this rook and bishop maneuver and the bishop here, the targeting of the e-pawn, and then this somewhat weird g6 move if the knight gets to here. So this is the Breyer system. So that brings us at last to the Berlin variation, which is the one I'm going to really end up recommending to you. It's easy to play. It doesn't have a lot of strange moves in it or pawn structures, and so therefore it should be a quick learning curve for you. So without further ado, let's look at the Berlin system in the context of some of these other ones that we've seen. And here we go. Now this is where the Berlin system is different. He doesn't play a6. He immediately attacks the e4 pawn. And among very new players, they might even play knight to c3, which simply transposes into the four knights game, which is, you know, black is not going to win because white did that, but it's less hopeful, you know, at higher levels. That's a lot less ambitious than playing the, you know, castles or d3 here. And again, if white just plays d3 here, he can get a lot of control of the position at the expense of being a little bit less ambitious. So castles is still the main line here. Takes. And now there's two lines. There's rook e1 and the d4 line. So we'll look at the d4 line first, because this is just like when he plays a6 and bishop a4 first, with the exception of the fact that black cannot absolutely prevent this anymore the way he could. If the pawn were here and the bishop were here, he can play b5 at the expense of having a target for white to aim at later. So this is like a staple. You know, white could actually play this move. I hope you see why that seems really bizarre. But then I'm going to ask you, well, how come it's not? It looks like black can just take the bishop with his knight. But if he does that, the move a4, and then the knight has nowhere to go. And white will pick it up on the following move. But still in all, it's not really best. He takes this way, and black should take like this, and then he takes. So they both have 7 pawns. And then after this trade, if you never saw this before, especially like if you're the white pieces, maybe you're sort of a beginner level player, you look at this and you go, oh goody, I'm winning, I've doubled his pawns and now he can't castle, and they think that black has made a mistake. Well, Sun Tzu said the art of war is deception. If you're the black pieces here, you want white to think that. Maybe he'll take a lot longer on the clock than he should, trying to find some forcing winning variation that's not there. And black will develop his pieces. And we're getting pretty far along here. Like this is going to actually come up in your game, but you can maybe get to this position in your game. So I'm going to go back one more time. And this is a way that the Berlin defense often goes. With the castles variation you take. And now if he goes rook e1, then you still go to d6. This becomes a move, and of course knight takes bishop is a blunder, and knight takes knight will win the black queen. So he's got to block the file or trade knights first. It doesn't make a big difference. In almost either way, we end up in, well, I've seen bishop f6 played here too. And black has been patient here, but his position is fine. I mean, if you're the black pieces and you look at this, this is a very normal, natural position. You know, you can go here and get one of your bishops, check, big deal. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind being the black pieces here at all. So we've seen d4 and rook to e1 here. Now, those are some slightly weird moves that black is making. And if you go wrong here, it'll be because of a tactical error involving the knight taking or a check along the e file. So that's what you have to be very careful for. Yeah, I've seen also here where white plays d4 and then he just goes bishop here. You know, if he does this now, bishop f6 is probably going to be like the main move. Yeah. So anytime he does this, you know, take with the knight, move the pawn, and then the knight can come back here. So black's pawn structure is good. He could decide to play g6 and bishop g7 if he wants to. He certainly can play d5, and he's not going to have a hard time getting the pieces out, and he has no real weaknesses. So out of all of these, this is the line that I would really recommend. Now there is one more difficulty that you might not be prepared for that probably doesn't require so much preparation because it results in a quieter game. Here, instead of castling, he can just play like d3. And that, you know, it stops knight takes e4. So this is played often. Now I hope you can see why white cannot win a pawn there. If the bishop takes the knight and then he takes back, he can't take the pawn because of queen d4 threatening mate and threatening the knight. So that's why c3 and castles are the main moves from here besides taking the knight. And then almost any time he takes that knight, you're going to take back with your d-pawn. And now that he's castled, you have to guard your e-pawn. And Alpha Zero showed us how to do that with this strange looking move. And although black's position is a little bit cramped and a little bit passive for a little while, see, he ends up getting a decent situation. And they both have a queen, 2 rooks, and a minor piece. So, I would recommend really to decide to play either the Marshall Gambit, but if you're going to play the Marshall Gambit, then you play A6, and you're going to have to be familiar with the exchange variation and some of the other white offshoots. If you play the Berlin defense, you get there immediately on your fourth move, and the only real variation involved here is whether white castles or plays D4 or plays D3 immediately. Hopefully this gives you some sort of a confidence and allows you to choose what you're going to play against the Ruy Lopez. And now I hope you'll get prepared for the other more popular choices of white, such as the Italian and Scotch game, and the moves that white normally plays at the lower rating levels, because you probably don't see the Ruy much. And be sure to spend plenty of your time studying endgames and tactics and so forth, because if you spend all your time worrying about openings, well, usually you don't get to play the openings you've studied until you've forgotten what moves to make. So, this is, again, this is Chris Goldthorpe, and you hopefully you will be subscribing, getting notifications, and watch my channel often. And we'll see you in the next video.